Yeah.
Okay. So from here on, the conversation will be on YouTube. So if you don't want your face to be up, you can just stop your face.
So how many people do we have there?
Right now, zero.
Yeah, just started. No one will come.
Yeah, actually, I see 9.
Yeah, so it actually changes over the thing. It goes up and drop and things like that. So, oh, Jeffrey, you're here.
Hi, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. Cannot wait to hear you.
Where did you see the advertisement?
Vision list or something? CVNet.
I see. Yeah, so the CVNet seems, hey, would you be interested in giving a talk at some point?
Yeah, sure. Oh, Brown, how are you?
Good. How are you?
All right.
All right, I will start recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's all up to you, Iris.
Okay. So it's a little bit past. Should we start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thanks everybody to be here, and we're glad that we have two excellent speakers to talk about attention and consciousness topic. Today. And let me briefly introduce the first speaker, Shao-Min. He receives a PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience from the Duke National University of Singapore Medical School, working with Hsieh, and he's currently a postdoc at Caltech in Shimojo's lab. And his works targets consciousness, attention, and how they interact with each other. Specifically, he has been interested in understanding whether and how unconscious processing plays a role in shaping our brain and behavior. And actually, in today's talk, he's going to talk about the attentional requirement of unconscious processing. Okay, let's welcome his talk.
Okay, thanks, Iris. Let me share my slides. Working for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks for the introduction. You can just call me Sean. And today, I think the format would be Tony and I will give like 2 short talks focusing on this topic of the relationship between attention and consciousness. So feel free to kind of chime in anytime you want. We just want to make sure that we're on the same page all the time, right? And we also will leave a lot of time for discussions, right? Right. So thinking about the relationship between attention and consciousness. This is a kind of a long-standing topic in the studies of psychology and consciousness, right? And actually, people used to believe that they are highly overlapped. They are one and the same thing, because essentially, when I feel like when I pay attention to something, I'm also consciously aware of it. So, phenomenologically, they might be one and the same thing. Less and less people hold this view nowadays. Nowadays, people believe that they are, different entities. They probably have different characteristics. They probably have different neural bases as well. So now, even with that, we can still, talk about the relationship between the two. How they overlap and are what happens when we don't have, either. Right, and that's what I'm gonna begin here. So in the scenario that we don't have attention and consciousness, that's typical for, say, patients in coma, right? They cannot mobilize their attention and they don't have conscious awareness of the sensory surroundings, right? And this probably happens when we are sleeping without having any dreams as well. Now, it's also very easy to observe where we have kind of both attention and consciousness. I'm hoping that's now. You're paying attention to what I'm saying right now, and you are consciously aware of my voice. Right, the other two kind of scenarios are trickier. There's a lot of debate about whether we can have consciousness without any attention at all. I'll leave this for now. I won't be talking about this in my presentation, but I'm happy to revisit this in a later discussion. Right. So instead, I'm going to focus on this chunk. Can we have attention or some sort of attentional effect or attentional modulation even when the stimulus is outside of this realm of consciousness? Right. So I'm certainly not the first one to think about that or to talk about that. Actually, if you look it up, there are quite a few studies focusing on this very topic, which is attentional modulation on unconscious processing or unconscious visual processing, to be specific. So I'm going to select just one of the representative studies right here because now who is actually one of the co-authors here. So Real Talk and I am now quite a few years ago, actually 15 years ago, came up with this study showing that they found the unconscious tilt after effect. So essentially, the tilt after effect happens when you have, say, a tilt in a certain orientation. So you adapt to this tilt for a while. Later, when I show you a vertical tilt, it would look like it's tilted to the opposite direction. So that's the after effect. They found that in this study, even when the adapter is invisible to their participants, the effect somehow occurs. Right. More interestingly, if they ask the participants to pay attention to the same orientation as the adapter, that boosts the effect. So this clearly shows that attentional modulation can occur on a stimulus that's suppressed and presented out of our conscious awareness. And so, like I said, there are several studies in this research direction. And when I review these studies, the first question that came into my mind was, how about high-level processing? How about more abstract processing? Can those processes be modulated by attention even when the stimulus is not entering our conscious awareness? So when we typically think about the hierarchy of visual processing, we think about it from, say, all the way from lower level to mid-level to high-level processes. So when we talk about lower-level processes, we are talking about, say, orientation detection or adaptation, as I just mentioned. When we talk about higher level processes, we're talking about more kind of abstract conceptual level processes. So in today's talk, I'm going to show you how attention modulates one of the higher level unconscious processes, which is semantic processing. So essentially, we ask, can attention modulate or how we extract meaning from an unconscious word? Right. So to test this kind of question, we implemented a paradigm that we call the double Stroop paradigm. So essentially, we have kind of two layers of semantic interference here. So semantic interference is kind of the key in a Stroop paradigm. So in the Stroop paradigm, typically you are presented with some colored words, right? And when they are consistent, tricky things might happen because if I ask you to name the color of the word, you get interfered by the meaning of the word because it's a lot easier to kind of extract the meaning of the word in this case. And that's the Stroop effect. On the other hand, if I ask you to name the word directly, it's less likely that you get interfered by the color. It's a weak effect and it's somewhat unstable. Sometimes it's called the reverse Stroop effect. So in our study, we basically define these two conditions as the high load and the low load condition. Essentially, color naming, you get stronger interference, those high low. The word naming experiment or condition, it's easier, those low low. So we don't really have a meter to directly measure the load of the task. It's all relative in our experiment. All right, so this is the first layer of our Stroop here. The second layer is that we introduced a invisible prime that is semantically congruent or incongruent to the target. Essentially, we're expecting to see that if the prime is semantically incongruent with the target, that's going to interfere with how you respond to the target. And more importantly, we want to know whether this unconscious semantic interference can be modulated by which task you're working on. Right, so let me tell you a little bit more about our procedure here. I'm going to show you three different streams. One is presented to their non-dominant eye, one to their dominant eye, one is closer to what they see. Essentially, we're using a binocular suppression technique here. Right, so at first we presented the prime under this binocular suppression. if you are familiar with binocular suppression, you might have heard of continuous flash suppression, which is invented by Liao right here. We are using a different version here. As you can see, the suppressor and the suppressed word, they are actually presented intermittently. So Brian and I, my PhD supervisor, Brian and I found this continuous flash suppression quite a few years ago, and we found that this one gave us even stronger suppression. But techniques aside, what you need to know right now is that we presented this prime. The subject is asked to report when they have detected any part of this prime. That's about it. So you can see this as a subjective report of their conscious awareness of the prime. So they only proceeded to the next part of the trial when they didn't do anything here. Otherwise, if they have detected any part of the prime, the trial ended. Right. So given that subjectively they didn't see the prime, they proceeded to the Stroop task. Right. So in the high-low experiment, in the harder experiment, they responded to the color. They named the color. In the easier experiment, they named the word. Right. To make sure that they really didn't see the prime, at the end of each trial, we also added in the objective measure of conscious awareness of the prime, which is a very simple 2FC location task. We asked them, was the prime presented above or below the fixation point here. So the rationale being that if they really didn't see the prime, their performance on this location task should be at chance. And that was exactly what we found throughout all the experiments that we did here. Right. So given that the prime was invisible to our participants, can the semantics of the prime interfere with how we respond to the target? The answer is yes. So now in the word naming experiment, which is supposed to be an easier experiment, a low experiment, participants essentially slow down by roughly 5% when the two words share different meanings. So the prime incongruency does get processed and interfered with how we respond to the prime, to the target, sorry. Right. Interestingly, with almost identical setup, except that in the other experiment, now we asked them to focus on the color, to name the color, the effect disappeared. So in this color naming experiment or the high-low experiment, we didn't see the effect at all. So first time when we looked at this data, these were really striking to us because, most people believe that unconscious processes are fully automatic. When we say they are fully automatic, that means they are not kind of modulated by how we utilize our attention in the task. But our first two experiments, the result here clearly showed otherwise. It seems that when we're working on something harder, the unconscious effect just disappeared. So the first thing we wanted to do was to make sure that this is really about the load of the task. So we wanted to come up with kind of a training scheme, meaning that, all right, this is a high-low task. How about we ask people to do this trial or do this task many, many times until they get really good? In that case, the load of the task should be lowered. And if this is really about load, then we should be able to observe the unconscious effect when the load is lowered. As a visual evil vision scientist, we actually asked them to do a lot of trials, over 300 trials. And if you are running this kind of experiment, you'll know that it's tough to do that many trials in this typical binocular suppression experiments. So that also allowed me to just look at the data here and split them into the first quarter and the last quarter data. All right, so essentially after roughly 20 to 30 minutes of doing the task, they got better, they got faster, and their accuracy is always high. These are young folks, they did pretty well. Now, we did exactly the same analysis in the first quarter data and the last quarter data. First quarter data, when the task was supposedly was still hard, was still difficult to them, the result was very similar to the overall data. Now, in the last quarter data, in the last few minutes of the task, when they show a kind of a decrease of reaction time, showing that they got better, and the load of tasks is supposedly lowered, we saw a very similar unconscious semantic interference. So these results suggest that when the task load is lowered, it seems that we have some additional attentional resources to be spent or to be distributed to the unconscious stimulus. And that's why the unconscious effect occurred. Now, let me briefly summarize what we found in the first two experiments. Right, we did find that the semantic incongruency between the prime and target slow down target response, right? And more interestingly and more importantly, this kind of interference is modulated by the load of the task that you are working on, right? So when the load is low, you get a stronger interference from this unconscious word, right? When the load is high, initially you don't get any interference, but then if you keep practicing until the load is supposedly lowered, that's where you get the interference again. Right, these are actually the main messages that I want to send out today. So very high level processes could occur unconsciously, and more interestingly, they can be modulated by the load of the task or the difficulty of the task that you're working on. Now, in the next 3 to 5 minutes, I'm gonna talk about some additional experiments that address some questions for people who really like to do psychophysics. All right. Now, we want them to ask basically 2 more questions. The first question is, what exactly is this attentional effect that we're talking about? I mean, over the past 10, 15 minutes, I've been trying to convince you that this is about the load of the task. But there's a kind of an equally likely candidate here, which is the cognitive set hypothesis. So what is this? So if you look at our 2 conditions here, when we ask people to name the color, it is high-low for sure. But then the cognitive set is also unaligned, which means that, in this case, in this condition, we're asking people to stay away from the meaning of the target, to focus on the color instead. Right. On the other hand, in a word naming experiment, it is low load, but it's also cognitive set aligned because we're asking them to focus on the meaning of the target, which might trigger the unconscious semantic effect. So this cognitive set alignment hypothesis seems to explain our data equally well, right? Another concern here is what stimulus feature is really modulated here. Again, I've been trying to say that this is about semantic processing, but in the first 2 experiments, we use both red and blue for the primes and the targets, although we jitter the locations of the 2, and we jitter the sizes of the 2 to make sure that this is not some lower level adaptation effect, but still it could be some sort of mid-level orthographic effect. So meaning that when the 2 words share different word forms, there is just some sort of orthographic interference going on here. Right, so to answer these 2 questions, in the next set of experiments, we changed the target words into navy and scarlet. So why did we use these target words? For several reasons. One, based on the previous literature and based on our own pilots, when you use words that have lower frequency, usually or sometimes the Stroop effect will disappear. And that's exactly what we found here. So when we use these words and ask people to name the color of these words, they don't get interfered by the meaning of the words, which is quite plausible because essentially it's just harder to extract the meaning of these words because they are lower frequency. Right, and on the other hand, when we ask them to name the word, they still get interfered by the inconsistent color. So essentially, we now have a double dissociation of the 2 hypotheses here because the load conditions in this new set of experiments are reversed. Now, naming the color is actually easier, but naming the word is harder. So this allows us to test these 2 hypotheses directly. And then, as you can see here, these 2 words now don't share any orthographic similarities between the prime. So if we found anything from this new set of target words, it means that it's really coming from the semantics or the semantic interference between the prime and the target. Now, if we found the effect in the new low-low condition, which is the color naming condition, then it suggests that it's really about the load. When the load is low, we get some additional attentional resources to be spent on the unconscious stimulus. On the other hand, if we found the effect in the new high-low experiment, which is the word naming experiment, then it suggests that it's about a cognitive set alignment. In either case, it's some sort of attentional modulation. But what did we find? So we found that in the new high-low experiment, the word naming experiment, there was no effect whatsoever. Interestingly, in the new low-low experiment, which is the color naming experiment, we found a very similar semantic interference effect. So again, on average, people slowed down by roughly 5 to 10% if the meaning of the prime was incongruent to the meaning of the target. Now with that, let me quickly summarize what we found here. We did find unconscious semantic processing under this binocular suppression. More interestingly, when the when these prime semantics and the target semantics were incongruent, people's response on the target slowed down. And importantly here is that the load of the task that you're working on actually gates this unconscious semantic interference. So showing that unconscious information can be dependent on how we utilize our attention in the task, right? So like I say, essentially our study provided a new piece of evidence to support that attention modulation can occur outside of this realm of consciousness. And we provided a piece of evidence to show that this attentional modulation can occur at very high level, essentially when we extract the meaning from a unconscious stimulus. Right, with that, I would like to thank my lab members and my collaborators and the funding resources. And if you are interested in reading the details of the experiments, the paper was out last year, or if you're looking for something to help you sleep, that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions for this study. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Questions from the audience? Okay, let me, okay, Hong.
No, not Li Xinhong.
Yeah, but that's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask 2 questions? So
please go ahead.
My first question is like, you're suggesting that if we have a low cognitive load, things can be processed unconsciously. As for like some studies suggesting that temporal integration cannot occur unconsciously, and some of them saying that it can occur unconsciously. I wonder what is your opinion regarding that, like temporal integration, is it a low cognitive load task or it is a high cognitive load task? And can you be integrated without awareness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So essentially, I guess what I'm trying to push or say here is that so a lot of studies use kind of null results to say that consciousness is needed in some cases. For example, temporal integration or some other more complex or in-depth processes. But I'm trying to find the kind of the necessary condition for these kind of processes. And here we're showing that the attention could be one of the necessary condition, which is, in order to process unconscious information, you probably need some level of attention. So one possibility could be, in previous studies, right? Some people found that temporal integration could occur unconsciously. Some people found that it couldn't. And one kind of simple hypothesis or simple explanation of these conflicting results could be, they're just using different tasks, and their tasks impose different levels of task loads, right? That could be something that we can easily examine in the future.
Okay, actually following that questions, I may ask a question. So in that sense, I was wondering, what is the nature of unconscious processing? So in this sense, I mean, according to your results, you're telling us that this kind of processing is not automatic. It's actually modulated by attentional set or cognitive effort or something. And then if that's the case, isn't it just implied that this kind of processing is just a regular processing? I mean, like a conscious processing, but we just feel like we didn't notice that.
Okay, there are several things that we can discuss here.
Yeah.
Essentially, they don't feel like they don't see the stimulus, right? They actually don't see it because based on our measurements and based on, there's, so it's, first thing first, it's invisible to them. And that's important in our study, right? And the other thing is, this does suggest that unconscious processes may be more similar to conscious processes than what people thought before, right? Which is, they might both require attention. They might both be able to process some, abstract level information, which is semantics. Yeah, so for that, I think that's something that we're trying to say here. That's correct.
Yeah, but so in that case, why do we need to distinguish between so-called like unconscious processing versus conscious processing? So in,
Please go ahead.
So from the brain, like neural processing's viewpoint, so in other words, what is the nature and neural substrates of this kind of modulation? Well, because all information are processed in the brain, in our neural system. And then from that viewpoint, why do we need to distinguish between a kind of unconscious or conscious processing? Because probably for the nature of the processing itself, it's pretty much similar. Is that what kind of implication that you wanted to say from the study?
Yeah, so again, there are quite a few things here. One is that not many people would agree with my view here, maybe. Yeah, so a lot of people still believe that, for example, there's a clear distinction between conscious and unconscious processes. Conscious processes are mainly for more high-level, complex, in-depth processes, and the unconscious ones are mainly for the other end, which is the lower-level processes. I think in general that could be right, it's just that we show that there's some incidents. It's not like this is a clear separation or distinction of the two. It's that in some cases, unconscious processing can be pretty complex as well, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is when we try to differentiate basically when we try to differentiate conscious and unconscious processes, right? I think the main thing here is the phenomenology, right? What happens, when an identical stimulus, what happens when we see it versus when we don't see it? What happens in our brain? Do we process this information differently, right? So actually, we did an experiment using a very similar paradigm, with fMRI, trying to look for some neural correlates or neural substrates of this attentional modulation. I'm still analyzing the data, but I might be able to answer your question pretty soon, I guess. Yeah, but essentially, one possibility could be, they're just quite similar. When we try to process information consciously versus unconsciously, the modulation, the regions that we recruit, they are all quite similar. But another possibility is that they are distinct. And if they are distinct, then I guess it's really accurate to ask the question that you just asked. Why do we have these two different processes? Because it seems that evolutionarily it could be redundant, right?
Right.
Why don't we just don't see anything at all? Or why do we just see everything? Yeah.
I think you guys are going a bit too far with this with the results that you presented so far, right? At least you haven't shown in this paper or maybe in this presentation you didn't show the effect when the stimulus are visible. So
no, I didn't show that. No.
Yeah, and in general, Iris, when you see things, the effect is much bigger.
Yeah, I know.
So unconscious and conscious is similar, is just a vast sort of misleading kind of statement. You kind of find this effect, but it's really tiny, right, in terms of the magnitude.
Yeah, but it's go toward the same direction. So it's while you might consider some people might consider it is really trivial unconscious processing because it goes to the same direction as conscious processing. And as you said, the effect is usually very small. So why do we?
Sorry, can I join?
Yeah, sure. Oh, hi, Hsin.
Hi, I'm excited by this. So let me just comment on this, just follow up. So there are two views about conscious versus unconscious. One is that it exists at online processing level, and there should be neural correlates of conscious versus unconscious. There are lots of fMRI and EEG attempts to try to dissociate two circuits, conscious versus unconscious, in memory domain, perception domain, emotion domain, everywhere. The results are usually very feeble. It's typically that the similar circuit or region of interest, a little bit of stronger connectivity between, I don't know, frontal lobe and somewhere else when it's conscious. So the second view about conscious unconscious is that it's just a strength difference of the processing, similar to noise or something. So I think Sean's results tends to vote for the latter view. And as Iris said, unconscious effect is weaker, but it's in the same direction. That's exactly what this means. So it's almost like we are talking about conscious unconscious dichotomy in scientist viewpoint, not in the brain. But as Sean said, there's still phenomenology distinction left over. And even Sean and I agreed that effort matters, task load matters, but people cannot report. So my proposal is zombie online. But zombie includes attention and task load and all those things, plus, as you may know, post-diction process. And this post-diction process exists in the brain, and that makes the distinction in the phenomenology. All those conscious report psychophysics are happening at least 500 milliseconds after real-time perception. So there's plenty of room for post-dictive reconstruction. Sometimes post-dictive process successful to consolidate, and they can verbally report. Sometimes they lose it. So that's my view.
Thank you, Shin. Sean, have anything to add?
No, I mean, Iris, you opened this can of worms, so I'll let you go with it.
Yeah, maybe we can come back after Tony's presentation. But
Okay. Well,
maybe Brown.
Yeah, let's take more questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brown wanted to say something.
So does the prime have to be in word form? Or if you use a color prime, let's say use color or some kind of objects that has color meanings.
Good point.
Can you get the same effect?
Yeah, actually, no. So in some of the experiments in this study, we did use colors. So basically just random symbols with colors. We didn't get any effect in that condition. Yeah, so which is kind of another layer of, I would say, weirdness here, because originally we thought that it might be easier to get a color effect because supposedly in the visual hierarchy, right, it's lower level. So it should be easier to get a color effect instead of the semantic effect. But one thing about the binocular suppression that we're using here is that we're using colors to suppress color. So that's a little bit unfair to any color effect we're measuring here. So maybe in the future, if we use another paradigm to induce invisibility here, that's better for any color effect that we want to find out here.
I see. Well, because it seems that if using color itself doesn't work, maybe this effect is related to word form inhibition rather than semantic inhibition. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, that's kind of addressed by some of the later experiments.
I see.
Yeah, so essentially when we use these different words for primes and targets, we still find the interference, right? And then in that case, right, both the congruent and the incongruent, I mean semantically congruent, semantically incongruent conditions are, I mean they both have different orthography for the primes and the targets, right? In that case, we still find this interference. So it's probably not just about the word form, but I do agree that it might be the combination of the two, because when we use these targets that have only the semantic relationship with the prime, but no orthographic relationship, the effect gets smaller, slightly smaller. It's still significant, but it's smaller. Yeah, so in the original experiments, it could be the combination of semantics and orthography.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So if there's no further questions, I would hand it over to Tony, I guess. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Let's thanks for Sean's presentation. And okay, let me introduce the next speaker, Tony. Let me see his channel. Zheng Huiying. Tony, hold on. Received his PhD from UC University College London, and he is currently an assistant professor at the National Zhengzhi University, Department of Philosophy in Taiwan. He's also affiliated with Research Center of Mind, Brain, and Learning and Directing Center for Phenomenology at the same school. And so his work, he mainly works on consciousness in different sensory modalities, especially somatosensory senses. And today, he's going to talk about a pretty big title, the consciousness and attention, and in a sense, it's unconsciousness versus inattention. So let's welcome his talk.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. So it's going to be a theoretical talk because I'm a philosopher working with scientists, and I did have some experimental papers to share, but not for today. So there will be lots of words and no demos and no diagrams. So please bear with me reading things out in the following 15 minutes or so. And I'll mainly talk about other people's work because I aim to work with Brown's lab on this very topic, and I wish to have feedbacks from the audience at this point. So maybe in the future, if I can talk to this group again, I will talk about things I've worked on, especially on body awareness or touch. But for today, it's going to be more related to visual consciousness and visual representation. Okay. So, so given the time limits, I will only discuss two things. So first, I'll very briefly distinguish 4 claims in Sean's talk. I was going to ask questions in the previous session, but I think it's better if I save it for now. And I will mostly discuss recent developments concerning sustained representation of perspectival shape, which I'll explain, and those are other people's works. I was going to discuss some terminological issues concerning the exchanges between philosophy and empirical sciences, and also my own take of the putative phenomenological overflow. But I'll skip them for now because later I realized I have only 15 minutes. But for the overflow, in the past, I've defended a weaker version of overflow, which combine net blocks view with some certain postdictive interpretation. Because in the literature, especially in philosophy, those who think that Sperling kind of partial recall paradigm case can be explained by postdiction, they think that shows that overflow doesn't exist. And I think that they are wrong. So my previous work on overflow is to make sure that a weaker version of overflow can sit well with the postdiction kind of interpretation, which we can come back to. Okay, so just one slide on Sean's talk. So I think the following 4 claims seem to be distinct, but can be found in the paper. The first one is unconscious processes require attention. That reflects the title, I think. The second one is attentional modulation extend to unconscious processes. The third one is there's a competition of attentional resources between unconscious and conscious processes. And this challenges the automaticity account of unconscious processing. So I think the talk is mostly, or the experiment is mostly about number 2 and number 3, though they are distinct claims. So it's possible to hold number 2 without holding number 3, though I think from the experiment, it's clear that they kind of go hand in hand. And I think they are well supported by the experiment. But I think claim or statement number 1 seem to be too strong for Sean's purposes, because I think the experiment and the project is not aiming to show that attention is required or necessary for unconscious processes. And maybe we can come back to it during the discussion session. And for number 4, I think it really depends on how people who hold the so-called automaticity account would formulate their view. Maybe some stronger formulation is refuted by the experimental result, but it's really depending on the exact formulation. So I think this is only a one slide comment on Sean's talk to generate more conversation. For today's purposes, I want to talk about what people have been calling perspectivalism and its opponents. So it's the view that perceptual experiences have the following two aspects. The first one, this aspect corresponds to the objective shape of visible objects as they exist in the environment at a distance from the viewer. For example, the rectangular shape of the surface of a desk or the circular shape of a coin. The other aspect concerns the perspectival shape of an object, that is, to the viewer relative 2D shape that would outline or occlude an object from a given point of view. So these psychologists, early Gibson, Mack, Palmer, and Rock, are said to have held this view. And this is the mainstream view in philosophy. And in the next slide, you will see anti-perspectivalism and what they are objecting to. So this anti-view has it that we do not literally see perspectival shapes, nor does the ability to recognize, to draw, or to describe the 2D shape that would occlude an object in one's line of sight depend on a visual experience of any such shape. So the two views agree that we see objective shapes. So when we see a coin lying on a desk, we see that it's round in most cases. But they're debating whether we also see what so-called perspectival shape, which will be explained further. So later Gibson is said to have held this anti-perspectivalism. Other examples are all philosophers, but they are minority. Most people hold that we not only see the objective shape, but also literally see the perspectival shape. Okay, note that this debate is not about retinal images but such, and I'll explain that in the next slide. So a philosopher, Jonathan Cohen, say that we can think about proximal representations, that is perspectival shapes, as parameters over which certain psychological computations are defined. And he further says that while there are many different ways to think about such parameters, one traditional view is that the value of the parameter for shape is something like the geometrically defined 2D projection of the distal shape onto a plane, approximately parallel to the front of the viewer's face, obviously computed somehow from retinal projections, but in a way that abstracts from details of the actual retinal projection. So the one problem of this debate is that people keep using different terminologies. So sometimes they say distal shape and proximal shape. And when they use the term proximal, other people might think that, well, you're talking about retinal images, but why are we talking about it? Because all of us agree that retinal images are so important for visual processes. And we all agree that we don't see our retinal images. We compute them so that we see things, right? So the whole debate is not about retinal images, but about whether something is abstracted from retinal image, that is perspectival shape. You see things from an angle and you see ellipse or oval and so on, whether you see them or whether you only see objective shape and then later construct the perspectival shape. And this will be clearer if I give later examples. So I'm going to talk about two empirical attempts, and I'll be focusing on the second one, but I think the first one is quite important as well. So Schrenkler and Wechsler proposed that if the elliptical profiles of a tilted coin are part of perceptual experience, then it should be possible to identify these shapes simply by attending appropriately to them. Otherwise, in order to identify perspectival shapes, they must first be constructed in the visual imagination. So here they are distinguishing between two kind of views and two kind of predictions. So if perspectival shapes are part of the visual experience, you should be able to pay attention to that aspect of your experience and maybe to guide your actions or to do some report. Or if perspectival shapes are not part of your experience, you need to construct it out of your visual experiences after that, and you need to use your visual imagination. So note that sometimes people ask whether perspectival shapes are visually represented without mentioning consciousness, or sometimes they speak of visual experiences, and this can be a problem. So in the second empirical attempt, in the formulation, they sometimes use visual experiences or consciousness, but you will see that most of their experiments are about visual representations without committing whether they are conscious, and this can be a problem. So I'm not going to talk too much about the first empirical attempt. I will just raise one concern that is out of my discussion with Brown's lab. So basically, they need to make too many assumptions to make sure their predictions will work. So they further propose that these accounts of perspectival identification can be tested by measuring the interference between visual and verbal working memory load, respectively, and the identification of perspectival shapes in the appearance of 3D objects. And they haven't really put this project to work, and maybe they won't. They are philosophers working with scientists, so maybe they are not going to do it anytime soon. But in any case, in constructing their cases, too many assumptions, or at least too many steps about attention, imagination, perspectival identification, visual memory, mental rotation, and change detection, and so on, are in place. And this can be really problematic because in order to be persuaded by their proposal and do the experiment, we need to make lots of assumptions along the way. And they do a pretty good job in sustaining those assumptions. They try to argue for their assumptions about visual working memories and so on. But still, if there's any step you are not happy with, then even if we do the experiment and we have the result, you can still question any of the step. So I'm going to use my final several minutes to talk about the second empirical attempt by another group, which I find more promising. And I hope to do maybe other experiments with Brown's lab to show that maybe there's some more work to do. And I hold no view for now. I think I'm more sympathetic with perspectivalism, but I'm happy to be refuted by our own data. So the second empirical attempt, another group, the Firestone Lab, says that if tilted coins bear a representational similarity to elliptical objects, then the circular coin should, when rotated, impair search for a distal ellipse. So this conditional or this statement can be roughly paraphrased as, given perspectivalism, a circular coin should, when rotated, impair search for a distal ellipse. I say roughly because actually in the experimental paper, they don't talk about objective shape. We are all assuming that we see objective shape, and we are debating whether we also see perspectival shape. So when paraphrasing using perspectivalism, actually I'm saying more than what they say, but it's easier to hold that in mind. So if perspectivalism is correct in holding that we also see perspectival shape, then this will follow, and they try to test whether that will follow. If not, then perspectivalism would be refuted. Okay, so the idea is if in the appropriate settings, we find that a circular coin when rotated does not impair search for a distal ellipse, then perspectival is falsified, which is what I was just saying. So the basic setting is this. So the instruction is to select the oval, which can be problematic and debatable. At the second stage, you see something like the middle row. I think intuitively, the right-hand side is supposed to be more difficult because the two objects look differently, but they are more similar. They look differently in illumination and the angle and so on. And the left-hand side is supposed to be easier, I think, according to most people's intuition. And this is only the basic setting, and they have done lots of experiment, follow-up, control experiment to make sure that other factors are excluded. Okay, so the task is to select the oval, which is different from ellipse. The authors use the more familiar but perhaps less precise term oval in their instructions to subjects. And I think this can be problematic, but we can come back to this. And the stimulus displayed until response stage. The left-hand side condition is supposed to be easier, and the right-hand side is supposed to be more challenging. I think I might get the left and right wrong, but we can come back to the picture later. So assuming that rotated circular objects truly exhibit a representational similarity to distal elliptical objects, that is, objects that are elliptical both in 3D and in 2D, then they should impair visual search for those objects. That is, if a subject must locate a distally elliptical object, they should be distracted by a rotated circle whose projection matches the shape of their target in ways that would cause response time differences. And I think this is an attentional task, and that's one reason why I picked this topic for today's purposes, because when it comes to consciousness and attention, I would think of things like Sean's talk or overflow or blind sight. But I think today's talk is also related to the original theme, even though it takes some time to see why it's related to attention. And there are some details I would like to keep. So more specifically, experiment 1 seeks to establish the basic conclusion that rotated coins does impair visual search for elliptical objects. And experiment 2 to 4 control for correlated properties and object rotation. For example, 75-degree versus 45-degree and rotated square object versus rotated circular objects. Experiment 5 and 6 consider reversing coins and delay responding. And experiment 7 generalizes the result to other shapes such as quadrilaterals. And finally, experiment 8 and 9 use real-world objects under naturalistic conditions with or without head constraints. So they have been trying to make sure that they take care of everything, but of course, it's not possible to really deal with every possible confound. So overall, I think, at least initially, they provide a solid case for perspectivalism by considering and controlling many potential confounding factors. But I would like to have feedback from the audience, and I will talk more about the back and forth after this. So I'm going to talk about things I don't really understand, but hopefully you guys can help me understand more. So another researcher he argues that conflicting shape percepts can be explained by the perception-cognition distinction. And more specifically, he argues that conceptually, perhaps rotated circle compete with frontal ellipses due to their shared 3D visual directions, as opposed to their 2D shape. So we can see that from experiment 1 to 9, this one is not controlled for. And he further argues that empirically, perhaps the rotated circular object did not actually look circular, since in the original paper, the computer-based experiment invoked 2D images and their pictorial cues, flattened depicted objects. And he further says that the real-world experiment required a viewing distance of 250 centimeters, in which shape from stereopsis may be compressed. In response, the original authors provide both conceptual considerations and a follow-up experiment that addresses the distance worry. So Paul Linton, the commentator, specializes in 3D vision. So I guess he has a different perspective, but the original author did reply recently, but I haven't really figured out what's really going on. So I'm basically just reading through the summary so that we know what's just happened in the literature. So it's still ongoing. I think it will keep inspiring both conceptual and empirical works in this ballpark. So finally, I will talk about some ideas from my discussion with Brown's lab, but again, things I don't really understand. So with Brown's lab, we plan to test perspectivalism with the method of fMRI adaptation, repetition, suppression, and see whether neuronal adaptation and stimulus expectation is involved. And this is the paper referred to, or they mentioned during the discussion, but maybe there's more we need to look into. Okay, so now I just want to summarize. So in this talk, I have very briefly distinguish 4 claims in Sean's talk, and I invite him and others to come back and comment on my question. So for the most part, I discussed recent developments concerning sustained representation of perspectival shape. And there are many back and forth that I might fail to explain along the way, not only because I don't understand them, but also because people have been saying lots of things that I'm not able to summarize within this short amount of time. So maybe it's already too much, but I'm really glad to be able to share with you these unoriginal ideas, which means it's all from other people's work. I haven't been doing any original work here. So finally, I just want to show a photo with George Sperling in 2019 in London. I was really lucky enough to be invited in a short, very small event, and he happened to be there. And it's quite interesting to see him in person after referring to Sperling 1960, the partial recall paradigm for the overflow debate. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, now.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with, I have a couple of comments, but I'll just want to, because as you said, you introduced a lot of topic. Possibly the audience may be a bit confused, but for your talk title was Unconscious and Inattention, right? And I just wanted to make sure that, what you meant was that, first of all, this perspectivalism and objective shape and the viewer relative perspectival shape, these two things may or may not be both conscious or part of them as unconscious. That's the kind of the dimension that you talked about as a unconscious. Yeah, maybe. And then attention and the inattention part is one of the experiments that asked people to pay attention to some of the aspects, like a perspectival shape aspect or objective shape aspect kind of axis, 2x2 kind of framework. Is that is my understanding correct, more or less?
Yeah, I think it sounds right to me, but let me explain in my own words. I do apologize for the generic title because I wasn't sure what I'm going to talk about. So, so for now, forget about consciousness, right? So one formulation of the debate is that we visually represent lots of things. And most people agree that we visually represent objective shapes. So the original debate is about whether our visual systems along the way also visually represent perspectival shapes, as opposed to constructing as opposed to constructing it afterwards in cognition. So that's why in Paul Linton's comments, he mentioned perception and cognition. So basically, we can ask whether perspectival shape is part of perception as opposed to cognition. And why consciousness is related is that a further debate or a different formulation asks whether perspectival shape is part of visual awareness or visual consciousness. And I think that already presupposes that we visually represent it, or we visually represent perspectival shape. And there's a further question whether we also consciously represent it. So that's where consciousness comes in. And where attention comes in, I think there are many ways. So in the first empirical attempt, they think that if perspectival shape is part of your visual consciousness, you should be able to attend to it if instructed correctly. And in the second empirical attempt, they think that certain kind of distraction would happen if certain view holds. So they try to test whether you will really be distracted in that kind of circumstance. So I hope this explanation helped the audience know more about what this is going on.
Okay, that's probably good clarification, but hope that it wasn't my own question. Is that all right? Can I ask my real question? So my real question is, okay, so understanding that, and your also the part of the phenomenology kind of the group, right? Who are interested in the conscious appearance and so phenomenal, things in itself.
Yes.
And from that viewpoint, I also, from as a consciousness researcher, I actually hate the term representation, to be honest. I should probably write at some point in a paper that we should probably ban the term representation altogether. But anyway, leaving aside of that thing, so just to get to the point of this, conscious appearance or phenomenology of like elliptic things of the coins and so on, rather than doing all these complicated and indirect, psychophysics experiment, I was just thinking that, why don't you just, ask people to rate the similarity of the things, and also just ask people to report what they, saw verbally, but, in a very, very many, huge amount of people. Like we have been doing this kind of thing, like a online experiment. But as you said, philosophers assume a lot. Assume and then assume and assume and assume, right? And then, where's the founding facts about the phenomenology? That's always my problem. So why don't you just, collect the phenomenological similarity data or verbal report data? I think that's much more fruitful than, your planned experiment of the fMRI, I think.
Okay, thank you. There are lots of questions. I will try to keep it brief, but we can come back to that. So about phenomenology, the different meanings of it. So, so in the title page, the Center for Phenomenology actually refers to the continental philosophy, which is there's a specific tradition called phenomenology, and this is less relevant for today's purposes. So I'll not really talk about it. For representations, I think it's a really problematic term, and now more theoretical works have been done in trying to figure out what we should mean by representations. Maybe so some people just think that we just mean information encoded, and representing is just another term, but other people have stronger notion of it. And I do agree it's problematic, but whether it should be abandoned, we can talk more about it. Why not just ask people to report and to rate similarity? I think that's definitely one thing we can do. So, but why people haven't been doing that? Because it's partly because this debate is really old. It's for several hundred years. And in the past, philosophers not only try to think about the debate, they also ask people around, and they get a lot of very complicated or very diverse reports. So I think nowadays we are more equipped to do very careful questionnaires to make sure people can report, and we have some quantitative data. But we need to worry about how we ask questions, right? Because people, when they hear what you see, they might have different assumptions. And maybe, you ask enough, you ask 10,000 people, and we don't need to worry about that. So that's definitely one direction. Philosophers making assumptions. So today I'm talking about other people's work, so I might be a bit unfair to them. So in the paper, they really try really hard to go into the empirical literature to back up their assumptions. So they would think that they construct lots of empirical argument to make sure every step is okay, right? So when I say they make so many assumptions, I was comparing it with the second empirical attempt. So in the second one, maybe it's problematic for other reasons, but at least the conditional, if something, then something, the prediction is quite simple. So it involves less steps. So that's one aspect. I think the second empirical attempt might be better than the first one. And finally, just a comment. So, it's maybe complicated to do such complicated psychophysical design, but I think some people enjoy that kind of stuff. So I guess it's okay to keep doing it, and we have more ramifications. Maybe we don't solve the original questions, but maybe we learn more along the way. Thank you.
Okay, Sean. I think Sean has some question.
Yeah, since I'm talking about semantics and I'm talking about unconscious processing today, so I'm gonna stick onto these 2 points, right? So when you talk about the competition of kind of visual representation in the second attempt, right? It seems to me that the competition doesn't have to be phenomenological, right? Maybe that's what they are trying to claim or what they are trying to do, but then one possibility could be that the competition happens at the conceptual level, right? When you have a tilted coin versus something tilted, right? This concept of tilted makes you harder to judge whether it's the same or different or whatever, right? So in that case, right, it's not about phenomenology, it's not about consciousness, right? It's about some sort of cognitive competition. What do you think about this? So in that case, it's kind of totally deviated away from perspectivalism.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that's exactly the second group wants to rule out, right? Whether they are successful is another issue. So let me ask, don't you think the basic reaction time setting is not working here? Because I think there are some basic results about reaction time in perception and further processing. So if the reaction time is quicker within, I don't know, a certain number, maybe it's a case for thinking that is within perception, not conceptual or cognitive competition.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of complicated setup, I would say it's probably hard to draw the line here, right? Usually people talk about, for example, if we know that this is really perceptual, when we look at very simple, for example, face recognition, and then we look at, say, the EEG data, something happens within the first dozen milliseconds, we will say that's probably perceptual. But in this case, their participants are quite free, right? They have given a lot of time to think about these figures, to look at these figures. So I'm not sure if behavioral psychophysics can differentiate cognitive and perceptual factors here.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether the so we had this conversation in Brown's lab meeting, right? So I had a vague memory that what we will propose would try to address this, but I'm not sure. So if Brown has anything to say, maybe this is time to come in. But you don't have to say anything if you don't want. I'm just reminding myself stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you ran the experiment that you proposed, the fMRI experiment, that can at least partially solve the question that I just asked, and maybe that's the same question for this attempt as well, which is because you can basically look at the visual hierarchy in your data, right? And then you can look at where the suppression occurs. Is it in the more lower level regions or is it in the more higher level regions, right? And then it's still kind of indirect, but at least this is some evidence that you can say that whether this could be more perceptual or more cognitive. Yeah, I guess that's one potential solution. Yeah, I'll stop here. I think Hsin has a question.
Yeah, can I actually, yeah. I have 3 brief comments. It's not question, it's comments. So of course I would like to hear, the answer, but let me just briefly say, in the overall picture, why do you guys just stick to shape? Because to me, the general question is, can we actually see something closer to the retinal properties? And that means for a bunch of things, not just shape, and just, you guys have to start from this mere fact. The retinal image is upside down and left, right, reversed. We never see it in the world. And those who know me, I did that, wearing left, right, reversing goggles for 1 week. So the beginning of whether or not we see something closer to the retinal image. And in this case, it's very, very difficult. We can imagine upside down, but we don't perceptually immediately, effortlessly see, upside down just as retinal input indicates. So my point here is that, well, there are a whole bunch of things starting from, this upside down, but also shape and depth and all those things. It really varies. The answer varies, and this is the one cause of the debate. So why do you just stick to shape? That's one comment. As for the shape inside, more specific, 2 comments. One is that it is definitely not all or nothing, one or the other. It seems like you guys have to try to decide one view or the other view is correct, but it seems to me that that's the essential phenomenological dynamics of perceptual experience. If I really want to do, I can compare the retinal image size with some effort when we compare 2 objects' size with entirely different distance, right? And but it's not natural, and if you measure reaction time, it might take longer and stuff like that. Even in the fMRI studies, some visual area may show the output of constancy mechanism. Some early areas may show, before that, the earlier properties. So it really varies, and the entire point is that we can do both ways depending on what the task is, and that's essential phenomenology. Nao's proposal of judging similarity is a very cute idea, but it suffers the same problem. The second comment, to me, the search, the search task with interference sounds very, very elegantly psychophysical and fundamentally problematic philosophically. Why? Because you guys cited Gibson 9050 correctly, but what he said, remember, is he compared impoverished versus enriched visual environment, and they behave very differently. And that essentially means that your target perception really influenced by the contextual surrounding, background, and our phenomenology is essentially context dependent. That's what Gibson is saying. Now, visual search is sort of mixing up dependent variable and independent variables to me. And it's kind of like, you can do such experiment, you can get the result, but it's sort of like, from Gibson's viewpoint, it's circular. So those 3 comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I will still say something, even though I don't think I have very satisfactory things to say. So why shape? The first question. I guess I can only answer from my very limited knowledge. So at least in my circle in philosophy, we like to compare shapes or sizes on the one hand and maybe colors on the other hand. And we think, for example, today's debate is less interesting in the case of color. So the debate more broadly is about the constancy aspect and the variable or various aspect of vision or seeing, right? So in color constancy, you see that the wall is of the same color, but actually, given the illumination and so on, you see that this patch is darker than the other patch and so on. And we think that it's less interesting to ask, in the case of color, whether not only we see the objective uniform thing, but also we see that this patch is darker than the other one, because we think that we obviously see both. But in the case of shape, at least some people think it's less obvious whether we see both the objective side and the perspectival side. So that's why we stick to shape. And I think this does not really address your point when you mention retinal images and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing, so you mentioned dynamics, and I think it's related to the perception cognition divides. And so there are two camps, right? So one camp think, when we talk about perception and cognition divides, we really carve nature at its joints. It's a real distinction in nature or in the world. The other side think, no, it's just for convenience, and it's really depends on cases. But I think for both parties, they would think that in real world interactions, it's all dynamic. even for those who think there's a clear line, we switch back and forth, and we have different processes in parallel. So it's not that one side thing is non-dynamic. I think all people agree that it's messy and dynamic. They just disagree about some underlying theoretical question about whether we can really draw distinction, say, between conception and perception, something like that. And the third one, I really don't know what to say, except that I think, so Gibson has lots of works, early, middle, and late. And I think people have different interpretations, and I'm no expert. So I'll say nothing about the third point, but I'll definitely keep in mind that maybe in the interpretation, we get him wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Hsin, do you still have something to say? I saw you still raise your hand.
No,
Just forgot.
No. Oh, sorry. I just forgot.
Okay.
I think he at least correctly understood my point, so that's fine. We can talking some other time.
Yeah. Okay. I think Brown.
So I'll just say say something related to Liao and Hsin's comments. So I think I totally agree with Liao that we should do like behavioral phenomenological research, trying to ask people how or what they actually see in this case. But in addition to that, we actually still want to do fMRI because, well, we think that sometimes in this case, people are not actually knowing what they actually see in this case. Well, because sometimes they will see this oval shape of coin in front of them, right? But if you ask them, is it really oval or is it a round shape? Well, sometimes they'll just make inference and they'll infer that this is a round shape and actually saying that this is round. So in this case, sometimes they'll just confound what they actually see and what they actually think. So that's why we actually want to do fMRI to try to tease apart this thing. And our idea is quite simple. We just simply want to present an perspectival shape, like an oval or an rotated coin in this case. And we want to know when this stimulus is processed in the brain, how is the brain representing it? And for example, is it being represented as more like an oval or more like a round shape or circular shape? And this can be easily tested with pattern classification. And this can also be tested in different parts of the brain. Like for example, in the lower visual area, this shape might be more oval-like or more perspectival-like. And in the higher visual area, it might become more circular also. And this can also address whether, this can also address the consciousness issue. Because, well, if we can present this stimulus unconsciously, then we can probably see that, well, when things are not being consciously perceived or seen, maybe the representation will be different in this case. So I guess, well, this is just a project we're trying to work on in addition to measuring their phenomenology.
Thank you.
Then maybe can I say something about as a follow-up to Hsin's comments and also Brown's? I mean, first, Brown's reply sounds fine with me. As long as you know what you're gonna get with the fMRI experiment is the neural correlates of what the people report or what you actually showed as a physical stimulus, right? So in that sense, you know, it is, you know, I don't need to criticize anything, but it will be along the same line as you know, what we have been doing, you know, over the last 20 years, right? Like either to find the neural correlates of out there or inside. That's totally fine as it is. But I thought that, you know, Tony's question was more to do with more like characterization or interpretation of this, you know, two theoretical camps of whether it's the perspectival kind of aspect or objective shape. Which one is what we are actually conscious of. And in that sense, the first part of your reply, Brown, says that subjects may be sometimes unsure, and I think that's the subject's phenomenology. So whatever you get with separation of the correlation into the physical counterparts of the oval or circular, which you veridically correlate with the external stimulus, doesn't actually tell you much about phenomenology of consciousness and mechanism of neural correlative consciousness. Actually, that's my reason why I said that the neuronal measurement will not tell us much more than what we probably know. We can find more detailed correlates across different areas of the brain. That's totally fine, great. That was my point. And then with respect to Shin's comment, we are getting kind of closer in a philosophical or position, I think, which is kind of interesting. But what you said, Shin, in terms of a contextual effect and relation to the natural phenomenology is quite close to what the IIT also identifies as a sort of essential aspect of the phenomenology. I also think that when I refer to the similarity experiment, I suggest actually to vary lots of contextual effects and so on, rather than just isolating a stimulus into two and then just change a small bit of the parameter, like the background or the shape or color or movement or whatever. Because as Shin was saying, each instance of the phenomenology is never independent or isolating one aspect from the other, right? So the contextual dependency or interference or interaction between the different aspects of the qualia are the ones that I think we need to understand more, and that can be done with I think in my lab, that's why I'm very excited about the online experiments. But if we test it in a huge number of the conditions, including many different kind of instructions that Tony said, like if we have 10 different ways to think about this task, just run the 10 experiments quickly, and we get 100 subjects in just 10 minutes in online experiment. So you can do it.
No, you are in the right direction, but Gibson knew it 70 years ago.
I see.
But you are in the right direction, yeah. Because okay. Gibson basically criticized reductionistic psychophysics by saying that when you are interested in red round disk perception, don't isolate it in the homogeneous background, because even the homogeneous background is the context. You cannot detach from anything, So you just have to compare various different situations. That's very laborious, and that's really going against, quote, well-controlled, unquote, psychophysics.
But my guess is that Gibson was not correct in the way that he didn't also think about the brain as the sort of the ultimate proximate cause of the conscious experience, right? That's also probably consistent with your view, correct. Which we kind of divided, yeah?
I'm shocked that you're finally becoming Gibsonian.
No, because I'm not in the end, so.
Yeah, me too. But I think what I learned from Gibson is that, you have to do, and this is not what Gibson said. We really have to do enriched phenomenology of not just subjective experience, not just brain, the relationship between experience and brain, but that should be studied from enriched phenomenology viewpoint.
Yeah.
I don't like our opinions getting close, but we agree.
So can I come back to my first slide? I would like to hear what Sean would say about those different interpretations.
Yeah, I think I in general agree with you. So 2 is kind of the results, right? The third one is my interpretation of the results.
which I think it's, I mean, it should hold unless, if anybody has any questions or text to this, I'm pretty happy to hear that. Yeah, and like you say, the first one is a bit of a stretch, right? I mean, it's basically, by saying that, 2 and 3 are plausible, it could be that unconscious processes require some sort of attention. But of course, I'm not testing everything here, right? I'm testing just one kind of unconscious processing. So it's a much bigger claim, right? And you are absolutely right that people have very different stances on the automaticity account of unconscious processing, right? So some people would say, okay, the very kind of firm believer of a full automatic account of unconscious processing would say, unconscious processing shouldn't be altered or interfered or modulated by attention at all. Essentially, this is the stance that we are attacking here, right? If you believe in that, then this shows that's probably not true. And there's a lot more experiments or studies that can, challenge this view. But most people probably do not hold such a strong view. Yeah, but then this is still kind of an intuition in vision sciences. So for example, when people talk about, say, pop-out, people would say pop-out is automatic, and people would say, pop-out cannot be, interfere with how you, say, deploy your attention in the task. When I add in more distractors, you don't get, say, worse performance, you don't get longer reaction time, stuff like that. Some people argue that maybe you are just not dealing with the right kind of attention, or maybe your task is just not hard enough. That's what makes it looks like it's automatic, right? So I would say that it depends on your stance on this, automaticity account. But surprisingly, people sometimes still hold this view that unconscious processes are very, very automatic. And I guess that's something that we want to, put it out there and say that, oh, maybe that's not, totally consistent with what people have been finding. Yeah, thank you. So I guess, if you hear other philosophers saying nasty things, they would say number 2 and number 3 are causal claims, while number 1 is constitutive or necessity claim. But we're very clear about why and where they are different. I think both of us are interested in not only number 2 and 3, but also number 1. But we also agree that it takes some other work, maybe some conceptual work to make progress in item 1.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe the only thing I wanted to just mention about this slide, Tony, is that you seem to not to distinguish between the attentional amplification and the inhibition, right? In this frame.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that at least when you read the results of different kind of experiment, that's probably one fundamental and useful also distinction. I'm not super sure about Sean's experiment, but when the task load is high, one possibility is that paying attention to that naming or color naming or word naming kind of thing either suppresses irrelevant feature or this high load thing amplifies what what is relevant. I don't know, but that's the kind of thing that neuronally we can probably study. It's I think in terms of neural substrate or mechanism, these two things are potentially quite different.
Yeah, I ran exactly the task that is, the same task with fMRI. So hopefully I'll be able to answer that question pretty soon. Yeah, but yeah, the idea is when I'm working on a higher load task, right? What is being modulated? I guess that's the question here, right? Because of course, we're trying to say that this is really about semantics, right? But it could be something else, and it could be that, like you mentioned, the direction here is still not very obvious. It could be that when you don't have attention, you have a suppression, or it could be that when you have attention, you have a I don't know, a boosting or some sort of strengthening of the effect. So either way could be possible.
Okay, so I think there's a subtle difference between the claim 2 and a variation of claim 2, which is that actually in Shao-Min's experiments, the unconscious processing of the semantics presumably already finished, right, by the time when the target shows up. So it seems that it's more like the task load, or it's more like when you're processing the targets, actually it's being influenced by the unconscious information or unconscious semantic information or not. And this unconscious semantic influence is stronger in the load, in a low load task rather than high load task. Right, so it seems that, well, rather than saying that attentional modulation extends to unconscious information processing, it's more like unconscious information exerts its influence depending on whether the task load is high or low, right? Just a small comment.
Yeah, so there are, I'm just gonna have a quick comment on this. So there are two possibilities here. One, as Brown mentioned, the unconscious processing is totally completed when it comes to the target, right? And the load of the target basically gates the effect, right? So when your task is pretty hard, you basically don't have any additional resources to process this already finished unconscious information, right? And when your task is the load of the task is low, then you have some additional information to process this information, right? But as Brown mentioned, the unconscious processing is already finished. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that maybe this is a contextual effect. So meaning that in the high load condition, just in general, in that whole block, because of the of the nature of the task, which is high low, right? Essentially, you stopped processing the information from the unconscious stimulus, right? You save your attentional resources for your conscious task. Right now, with behavioral data, we cannot distinguish the two accounts. But yeah, that's something we can test in the future.
Okay, I think it's getting long, but I think Xinhao, am I pronounced correctly this time? Xinhao has, maybe we'll take his last questions.
Okay, I just want to clarify, yes, is it Xinhao? Yeah. Like when we are discussing about the debate regarding attention and unconscious processing, we are talking about endogenous attention or top-down attention, and the relationship between exogenous attention and unconscious processing is clear enough, like from the previous studies, or is there anything that you are like specifically want to talk about?
Is that a question for me or Tony?
I think I don't really know. I just like.
Wait, let me clarify the question again. So are you asking which kind of attention we are talking about in the current context?
Yeah, this is kind of my first question. The second question is, do you think that the relationship between unconscious processing and exogenous attention is clear? And then the relationship between unconscious processing and endogenous attention is not clear. That is why we are having like a lot of debates now.
Yeah, I can. Okay, for the first one, let me take the first one. The second one is still quite complicated for now. Yeah, for me, in my study, I'm basically assuming or talking about a kind of attention, which is I'm treating attention as a general cognitive resources. And this is proposed by Nili Lavie in her low theory. Essentially, I'm treating this as some sort of, like currency, right? If I used up my currency in this task, then I don't have any more in the other task. That's what I'm trying to say. But of course, there are other kinds of attention, as you mentioned, right? You can have spatial attention, you can have temporal attention, you can have feature-based attention. Those are not discussed in my study. But when I talk about the cognitive set alignment, right, you can actually interpret that as some sort of feature-based attention, right? I mean, if I ask that in a different way, right, I can say, okay, when I'm paying more attention to the semantics of the word versus when I'm paying more attention to the color of the word, would that kind of gate different kinds of unconscious processes? That's another way to ask that question. So it's relevant to feature-based attention, right? Except from that, yeah, in my task, in my experiment, I'm only talking about the kind of the general kind of attention. Yeah, the second question is kind of tricky. Wait, are you okay, you're asking about a relationship between unconscious processing and exogenous attention.
Yeah, I mean, I remember like decade ago with Dr. Hsieh Brown with Nancy Kawish's paper about, I really remember whether the authors are Dr. Hsieh Brown, but like the pop-out effect or like something like the exogenous attention will be captured unconsciously. And now we are having a discussion. I think it's more like an endogenous attention. So I just wonder, yeah, like the dichotomy of attention and their relationship with unconscious processing.
Brown is right here, but I can respond for him. And if I'm wrong, he can correct me, I guess. Yeah, so essentially what he found in that study is the pop-out effect. The pop-out effect would occur even when it's suppressed binocularly, right? So when you have a ring of color singleton and one pops out, and when you measure the visual sensitivity in that pop-out location versus a non-pop-out location, you get a better performance. That's about it. And in the later experiments, he showed that if you ask people to do a dual task, a central visual RSBP task, this unconscious pop-out effect would disappear. So essentially, you can get an unconscious effect, and which is it kind of orients your attention to a location, to a specific location. So unconsciously, it seems to have an effect to direct your exogenous attention. But then when I try to deplete your top-down attention, that effect goes away. That's what he was trying to show, right? In here, you're right. We're not talking about exogenous attention. We're talking about maybe like what you mentioned is more internal endogenous kind of attention. But we really didn't make that distinction or assumption in our study.
Yeah, I think those questions are really, those are big questions that you should take lectures to. There's a lot to explore. But anyway, thanks for Sean's answering. And I think we're getting, it's getting long. So now can I just close the session? Yeah, let's thanks today's two speakers and then nice simulated discussions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just finished the stream.